Welcome to the University of Houston's series on critical issues in energy. I'm Ramanan Krishnamurthy. I'm Chief Energy Officer here at the University of Houston, and I'm emceeing this event. So without further ado, let me start off by kicking this program off to one of our academic leaders here, the Chief Academic Officer and Provost of the University, Dr. Paula Short.
Well, welcome to all of you. We're delighted to see so many of you here. Welcome to our wonderful UH students that have joined us. You're in for a treat tonight, and we're just delighted to see all of you. This is the second in our energy series, our 2014 UH Energy Speaker Series on critical issues in energy. And I think most of you in the House know that Houston is the energy capital of the world. Among the many things that Houston is #1 known for, it certainly is being the energy capital of the world. And I want to, first of all, acknowledge the leadership of our Chancellor, our President, Renu Khator, for making energy one of the 3 focal points for the University of Houston: health, energy, and the arts. And it's her leadership that has truly made energy at the University of Houston a priority. And the creation of our UH Energy is a critical link to our industry partners. And to the industry partners that are represented tonight, you are absolutely critical to our efforts to have an impact in the energy sector. And we appreciate all that you contribute and all that you do in collaboration with UH Energy. We have, I believe, one of the most comprehensive programs in energy in both our undergraduate and our graduate and our continuing education here at the University of Houston. As most of you know, our subsea engineering program is the nation's first, and it certainly furthers our reputation as an energy university. I want to also recognize and thank our Presidential Energy Advisory Board, which is our connection with our industry leaders. We thank you for the guidance and the efforts that you put forth in helping us be the energy university. I also want to recognize Dr. Krishnamurthy, who has taken upon that daunting task of taking our footprint in energy to the next level. He certainly is an energy talent, someone that works tirelessly to promote energy, UH Energy. And many of you might not know that he recently became a hit in making a pitch for energy. He was one of the 3 top presenters at the recent meeting in Miami, where he had 5 minutes to give a pitch for UH Energy, and he was chosen as one of the winners and brought home 10 grand. We'll take whatever we can get. Let's give him a hand, a round of applause for that wonderful effort. And it is through his leadership and his innovative approach to UH Energy that I think is helping us to achieve our mission as an energy university. And I just want to say thank you to Dr. Krishnamurthy for his extraordinary leadership. As provost, it is a great pleasure to work side by side with him. So thank you for being here tonight. Thank you to our guests that we will enjoy in just a few minutes. And it is now my pleasure to welcome Ed Spalding from Chevron to the podium, who will introduce our speakers for tonight. And again, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Short, for that introduction and for hosting tonight's event. Chevron is proud to be the sponsor of the University of Houston Energy Symposium series, Critical Issues in Energy. and to help facilitate and encourage dialogue around these very important topics. We're also proud to support the University of Houston in several ways, specifically around the petroleum and subsea engineering programs, and also with Houston Public Media. While it happened a few years ago, we also applaud the university for becoming a Tier 1 research institution, and the only one here in Houston. So congratulations again to the University of Houston for that honor. Tonight's topic is America's energy infrastructure. Is it safe? This is a very important topic, as moving both crude oil, refined products, and natural gas around from where it's produced to where it's used is fundamentally important to our society. For my company, we move probably 2 million barrels a day of oil and gas and gasoline around from one place to another, and having that being done safely is absolutely critical to our business. It's going to be very interesting tonight to hear the perspective of our panel and then to hear the audience questions. So I'm looking forward to the presentations this evening. So tonight, we are going to be moderated by Candace Beakey, who's sitting here to my right. She's the editor-in-chief of the Houston Business Journal, one of the nation's oldest business-to-business news publications. In this role, she oversees the editorial products of the Houston Business Journal, including the weekly paper, website, and a whole series of special events. She joined the journal in 2010, and since her arrival, they have won a series of awards. She is a graduate of Western Michigan University with a bachelor's degree in public relations and a minor in journalism. Please join me in welcoming our moderator for tonight's event, Ms. Candace Beakey.
Thank you. Thank you to Chevron. Thank you to the University of Houston. Thank you to everyone who ventured out tonight in this terrifyingly cold weather. Half of your people seated on the stage tonight are from Michigan, so we have no sympathy at all. Thank you to our panelists tonight. How it's going to work is I'm going to introduce each of these gentlemen, and then they're each going to present for about 5 minutes a little bit of information that we need to know to understand the basics, the infrastructure of talking about infrastructure. Then I have a few questions for them, all very difficult and challenging. And then my colleague, Jordan Bloom, our energy reporter, is going to field your questions. He's going to help facilitate the questions you have. So please jot them down, or if you have a better memory than I do because you're young, great, remember them. And we'll have a robust discussion for as long as we can. Okay, let's get started. Steve Magness is a partner in Cogent Energy Solutions, a crude oil, condensate, and refined products distribution and marketing business. Before forming Cogent, Magness was the director of Musket Corporation, a crude oil, condensate, and refined products supply, trading, transportation, and marketing company. He also served as president of Professional Energy Services, a developer of financial trading strategies and technology, and a consultant with Professional Energy Management. Magness holds a bachelor's degree in public administration from the University of Oklahoma. He serves as a non-executive chairman of the board for Professional Energy Management. Please welcome Mr. Magness. Carl Weimer is the executive director of the National Pipeline Safety Trust. He also serves on the governor-appointed Washington State Citizens Committee on Pipeline Safety as a member of the U.S. Department of Transportation's Technical Hazardous Liquid Pipeline Safety Standards Committee, the Steering Committee for the Pipelines and Informed Planning Alliance, and the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association's External Advisory Panel. Weimer currently serves as chairman on the Whatcom County Council. He has organized 9 national pipeline safety conferences and runs the National Safe Pipelines and LNG listservs. Weimer has a bachelor's degree in natural resources and environmental education from the University of Michigan and an associate's degree in industrial electronics technology from Peninsula College. Please welcome Mr. Weimer. Charles Esser is an oil market analyst focusing on non-OPEC supply in the Oil Industries and Markets Division of the International Energy Agency. He is associated with the International Energy Agency, part of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Esser was previously a consultant doing energy-related projects for various clients in the for-profit and nonprofit sectors. Prior to that, he was the energy analyst for the NGO think tank, the International Crisis Group in Brussels. He has also worked at both the U.S. Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration and at the U.S. State Department. Esser holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the College of Worcester and a master's degree in international relations and international economics from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Please welcome Mr. Esser. And Mr. Esser is going to begin and kick off the presentations tonight.
Thank you. So yes, what I'm going to try to do, good evening, by the way. What I'm going to try to do is give a bit of an overview of the midstream, that is the transport infrastructure, particularly in the oil industry in North America, and also get into the issues of safety related to pipelines and rail, some of the main issues. So in a sense, try to set the stage a bit for the next two speakers. So I thought I'd begin by just looking a bit at why pipelines sometimes, why rail, what is the comparison? When you look at pipelines, of course, you're looking at a lower cost per kilometer, or per mile, though the initial costs are higher. And so that's an important consideration. Another is that it's safer on a per barrel basis, and a scenario such as we saw in Lac Mégantic in Quebec would be difficult to envisage with just a pipeline. However, there have been pipeline instances as well. Pipelines are more efficient, have lower emissions, but they also require a great amount of fill before they can be used. Rail is quicker to respond to new upstream developments. In other words, you have booming production, for example, on the Bakken shale play, and you can get rail there pretty quick. You have flexibility with endpoints, so once it's into the rail system, you can move it around, whereas the pipelines are much more dedicated beginning point to endpoint. Initial investment costs are lower. Oftentimes the rail is already there. You just need to have the rail cars. Rail can sometimes avoid certain political obstacles, particularly when rail, unlike pipeline, requires less permitting to cross international borders. You can adjust rail to optimize your netbacks. And however, with rail, producers sometimes have to accept large differentials in order to take the crude. I thought what I would do, one of the things that's important to understand about the North American energy infrastructure is the integration, the great degree of integration between the Canadian and US systems. So I thought it was important to talk about the Canadian system a bit, and as well, it's important because regulations that are imposed in Canada will affect the US and vice versa. The Canadian system pipeline system is largely designed to bring crude south, not east-west, and this is important because it means the Canadian crude basically, to be exported, can only go to the United States. This is a big issue right now in Canada. It's important as well because the differential that, on West Canadian Select, which is a major Canadian grade, is affected by the fact that they don't have an alternative export route. About 3 million barrels per day of crude moves through Canadian pipelines. However, rail is growing rapidly, about 550,000 barrels per day by the middle of this year. As I said before, rail can sometimes be there to adjust or be an alternative when political issues block pipelines, and so rail has been an important way to get Canadian crude into the US when pipeline capacity either could not be built because it takes time or because of political issues. Looking at safety, one of the important things is that earlier this year, in April, the Canadian government decided to put new regulations for tanker cars. The oldest and least resistant tank cars, the DOT 111 series, have been banned, and the ones that are the remainder have to be retrofitted or replaced by 2017. Because the cars are often crossing the border, this will affect the US even if there are no new regulations in the US. And it also will probably push the US into taking a decision quicker than would have otherwise done so. You can see in the US system as well that product which is the purple line, is much more, brings product east-west, whereas crude, which is the orange lines, moves more east, north-south. The system is hence set up in such a way that imported crude would come into the coasts, and crude produced in the mid-continent would move north-south. About 22.7 million barrels per day moves through about 100,000 kilometers of pipeline. Another important thing, of course, is that oil can be moved within the United States by port. However, because of the Jones Act, which requires US flagged and US crude tankers to transport domestically, it's actually more expensive to take crude within the United States, say from the US Gulf Coast to the US East Coast, than it is to take it to, say, the East Coast of Canada. Rail use has grown rapidly. It's about 880,000 barrels per day, perhaps even higher now. That was about in the middle of the year. In large part, that's because of the Bakken shale play, which did not have the pipeline capacity to take the booming production there out. And that has been a major point of concern. It was certainly some of the accidents that have happened have had Bakken crude, and the accident in Canada, which was a disaster, was Bakken crude. And so I think there are a number of things to consider there. The amount of spillage from tanker cars has increased rapidly. However, it's still small in absolute terms. Rail accidents in 2013 spilled about 1.15 million gallons of crude oil, which is still a very small percentage of the overall system. However, it is larger than the pipeline crude, and in addition, it's a 50-fold increase compared to the average from the 1975 to 2012 period. Now, as I mentioned, in Canada, they've already put in new rules for the tanker cars. This is under consideration by the US Department of Transportation. Whether, for one thing, should tanker cars be retrofitted or replaced? Secondly, should there be speed limits? And then thirdly, is there something about Bakken crude in particular that makes it more volatile and hence need greater safety regulation? The industry as well has said that the issue of track integrity and inspections should also be at the forefront, and not just the issue of tanker cars and the volatility or the relative volatility of Bakken crude. Is Bakken crude more volatile? The Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration says yes. A Wall Street Journal analysis says yes. The American Fuel and Petroleum group said yes, but it doesn't matter because it's only slightly so more greater. However, the North Dakota Petroleum Council said no, it's not more volatile. Whether Bakken crude will require special cars is yet to be seen, but it seems likely that there will be new regulations that will require new tanker cars to have greater safety features and also tanker cars to be retrofitted. New build in North America is mostly about bringing crude to the massive refining capacity on the Gulf Coast. However, in Canada, it's also looking for export alternatives to both the East and West Coast, as you can see there. However, rail will continue to be important to bring mid-continent crude to the coasts. It has backed out large amounts of imports from coastal refineries in both the East Coast, in California, Washington State. An end to the export ban on crude oil would have a limited, though I don't say insignificant, effect on this because of the midstream constraints. In other words, because the pipeline is not there necessarily to get out the crude oil from, say, a place like Bakken, it's already quite expensive to rail it out just to refineries on the East Coast. The idea that it would suddenly go out through East or West Coast ports is unlikely. However, with new build, price differentials will change. Crudes that are relatively more expensive here in the Gulf Coast would come under pressure as more and more crudes from the mid-continent come south. Finally, I think, and one important thing to consider for the future for North America is whether the energy reform in Mexico would bring greater integration with the US and Canada with Mexico in terms of pipelines. Currently, there are no crude oil connections between Mexico and the United States. However, under the terms of the Mexican energy reform, the pipelines are to be the pipeline sector is to be completely liberalized and open to foreign investment, open to private investment, open to completely private ownership. So there's a potential that the Mexican crude oil could move, instead of by tanker, by pipeline, or that US crude oil could move south, particularly if it were optimal, that lighter oil would go to Mexican refineries and heavier crude oil from Mexico, which is already the case, would come up to US refineries. But this is not likely to happen quickly in any case. And I'll be back for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Next is Mr. Weimer.
Good evening. I appreciate being here, and I would like to thank the sponsors for the invitation. I live up near the Canadian border, and we refer to Houston as Calgary South, but not when you're in Houston, you don't. I want to tell you just a little bit about the Pipeline Safety Trust, just to give you a little context for whatever may come out of my mouth this evening. The Pipeline Safety Trust is really the only national nonprofit organization that focuses on pipeline safety from a public interest viewpoint. The Pipeline Safety Trust was born out of a tragedy in Bellingham, Washington in 1999 when 250,000 gallons of unleaded gasoline ruptured from a pipeline, flowed into a salmon stream that runs right through the middle of our town, and when it found an ignition spot, it killed every living thing 2 miles up and down that pipeline, including these 3 kids that were playing in a park at the time. At that time, the Bush Justice Department, as they were prosecuting this case, was so aghast at the way the pipeline company had operated and maintained this pipeline, and equally aghast at the way the federal regulators had provided oversight, that they went to bat for the idea of creating a national watchdog organization to keep a look at both the pipeline industry and the regulators, and that's where the Pipeline Safety Trust came from. One of our basic beliefs at the Trust is that for pipeline safety to really move forward, all the involved stakeholders need to be involved, and that includes certainly the industry, the regulators, and a lot of our emphasis is in trying to get better inclusion of the public and citizens who are often missing in these discussions. I'm going to give some very quick 30,000-foot level statistics about pipeline safety. A lot of what we're talking about here this evening is risk of pipelines, and as you probably already know, risk has two components. It's the probability that something's going to happen versus the consequences if it does. This is a 20-year look at the three major types of pipelines. As you can see, the hazardous liquid pipelines, the gas distribution pipelines have a downward trend over the last 20 years. The bigger gas transmission pipelines have been trending upwards. As anybody knows that plays with statistics much, you can tell different stories with different pieces of the same statistics. Here's the exact same statistics looking just at the last 8 years. And what you'll see in these is that natural gas pipelines, both types are doing pretty well, trending downward, but for some reason hazardous liquid pipelines are having an increase in incidence. This is an important slide because over this time frame was when a lot of new regulations were kicking in that were supposed to make things safer. So it's kind of a head scratcher of why that hasn't worked very well on the hazardous liquid side. If you drill down into the hazardous liquid pipelines, the three major types, you'll see that they're all having increasing incidents, but in particularly it's the crude oil pipelines that have incidents increasing a little faster than the other types. And this is a slide I like to show because so much of the discussion in the media is about our aging infrastructure and that's why we're having so many pipeline incidents. And that's true with distribution systems on the East Coast, but for the major transmission pipelines, it's not aging infrastructure, and in reality, new pipelines are failing much quicker than the old pipelines. Here's just a quick couple of graphs that show why pipelines fail. These are the different types of natural gas transmission pipelines on the left. Major failures are things that are well within the operator's control: corrosion, welds, material. On the right-hand side is distribution, and it's a little different story there. Not all pipelines are the same, and a lot of the problems with those are excavation damage, people hitting them where they're digging. On the liquid side, if you look at crude oil pipelines versus product pipelines, similar graphs, but you'll see that the crude oil pipelines have a larger problem with corrosion than the product pipelines. If you drill down even farther to look at internal versus external corrosion, you'll see that the crude oil pipelines have a higher incidence of internal corrosion, which tends to indicate that it's the product itself that's causing the problem. One of the things I didn't mention is if you looked at all these graphs, the number of significant incidents on pipelines any year is 200 to 300. There's more than 2.5 million miles of pipelines, so the chance of a pipeline failing anywhere is very, very, very small. So the probability is a pretty small probability. And the industry loves to focus on that probability because it's a very, very small number. The public and the media, on the other hand, likes to focus on the consequences. And there's been some very high-profile consequential failures in the last 4 or 5 years. Here's some pictures of some of the major natural gas failures in the last few years. And here's some of the major hazardous liquid pipeline failures in the last few years. Just a few, as I close out, a few issues that we think are high priority issues for pipeline safety. One of the things that pipelines had going for them over railways is most of the major transmission pipelines were built in rural areas. They tried to avoid population centers. This is a picture taken near my home in Washington State in 1990. The next picture is the exact same aerial 12 years later. And as you can see, this is going on all over the country where our communities are moving out on top of what were once rural pipelines, kind of negating some of that benefit. We're also putting a lot of new pipelines in the ground because of all the amazing new production that's going on. This is a small county in Pennsylvania. Each one of those dots represents a drill rig. Sooner or later, all those dots will be connected with gathering lines. The thing to remember about these rural gathering lines are they weren't in any of the statistics I was talking about earlier because they are completely and totally unregulated, even though they have the same risk profile as the other types of pipelines. This was in 2008. Here's the same county in 2012. Connect all those dots with pipelines that are totally unregulated, and we have a high risk. And just a couple closeout comments. Our infrastructure itself has problems that sometimes aren't into the safety equation. Natural gas pipelines are known to leak. That's become a bigger problem because of both the loss of money and the concerns with the atmosphere. The picture on the left is just leaks within the city of Boston. Also, that our production has taken off so fast in certain places like the Bakken crude, where they're worried about getting that oil out, that a lot of other materials are being wasted. I think it was the Wall Street Journal that estimated $50 to $100 million worth of natural gas is being flared in the Bakken crude every month because there's no capacity to capture it or transport it. And finally, something we're not going to talk about much this evening, but it's becoming a larger discussion as we talk about this, is the chance of the safety of pipelines are pretty safe. Whether they're safe enough, I think I agree with the industry that the answer to that probably no, because we're trying to get to zero incidents. But we very rarely consider, climate change and those types of issues when we talk about safety. So it's not only can you move it from point A to point B safely, it's whether you ought to be moving some of this material at all. Thank you.
Please welcome Steve Magness.
I thought it might be useful really just to talk a little bit about the history of, really this is going to be focused on crude by rail eventually, but I want to start way, way back in the late 1800s when we discovered crude oil, not discovered it, but found it here in the U.S. And people started using it to replace oil from whale fat. They liked the effects of the kerosene that was used to light the night. And ever since then, we found new uses and over time have found that energy, particularly petroleum energy, has been very, very valuable in our economic development and in the quality of our lives. People who started back then decided, well, to refine it, where do I put these refineries? Back then, putting them very close to where the oil was made sense. There's really 4 dimensions in locating refineries. It's how far do you have to transport the feedstock? How far do you have to transport the product that's produced? What's the cost of the energy? And then the availability of technology. As the oil started disappearing and the refineries remained and oil was discovered in other places, transporting crude long distances became an issue. Rail was employed. It worked. Matter of fact, most of us recall the history of J.D. Rockefeller getting crosswise with the railroads and eventually owning his own railroads. And that was the way things were done. Pipelines were just beginning. Pipelines were very little more than ditches and or wooden tubes at the time. Eventually, pipelines became more sophisticated. During World War II, energy became highlighted domestically, moving energy around. Obviously, energy has been very, very important in our history, but particularly supporting long distance, very long distance transportation of refined products pipelines and pipelines became very, very popular during that period of time. And the rail kind of disappeared. All the rail infrastructure that was built to transport crude oils and refined products around slowly disappeared. So fast forward now to 10, 12 years ago, and new technologies, the hydraulic fracturing, the horizontal drilling, that the successes that we had in the Haynesville and Barnett shales on the gas was then employed by independent producers, particularly up in North Dakota, the Bakken, and successfully started producing crude oil in formations that basically not abandoned but had dwindled in importance over time. The problem there was, even though infrastructure did exist, it was built for the 1950s or built for much earlier times. It was dated and very limited. Had tremendous success producing this crude oil with these technologies. All of a sudden, we wake up and we're producing more crude than we can actually take away from these oil fields. Producers and not yet demanders at that time looked around for solutions, a very long distance trucking of crude at the time, and had happened on a group of entrepreneurs that had already started up transporting liquids, particularly ethanol at the time, as ethanol became part of our energy makeup, to come in and help solve transporting crude very long distances. In those early days, there was not processes and systems and well thought out ways of transporting crude by rail, particularly loading rail cars and offloading rail cars. A lot of experimentation, a lot of entrepreneurs came in, particularly, like I said, those who had been active in biofuels, and came up with a lot of different ways to do this. Slowly over time, instead of rail being a short-term solution, in the meantime, why the infrastructure could be built out, the demanders, the big refiners, started realizing there's a lot of benefits to rail. Some of the benefits were, transit time. You can rail crude oil, say, to the Gulf Coast from North Dakota in 4 or 5 days, rather than hopping from one pipeline to another and taking 40 days. Maintaining the integrity of the crude oil. It's being put in discrete packages in these rail cars. Instead of putting it in a pipeline that's mixed with Canadian crude and other crudes. Time value of money, obviously, that's related to the timing. The optionality of being able to take the crude to multiple destinations depending on what the arbitrage is, on what the market tells you where the value of the crude is very, very valuable to them. So these things are realized slowly over time. And so now the larger companies, particularly the demanders, the refiners, started getting involved and started supporting the movement of crude by rail. And it kind of started looking like rail might be part of the long-term solution in addition to building pipeline infrastructure. One of the most important aspects is the commitment it takes to build new pipelines. So as we continue to succeed to produce more and more oil in areas with limited takeaway infrastructure, you had to decide, well, do I build new pipelines? Building new pipelines are many-year commitments, 17, 20-year commitments. You're committing to large volumes to justify the cost of building billions of dollars worth of pipeline infrastructure. Building rail, you don't have to make very long-term commitments. You don't have to commit a whole lot of volume to justify the incremental cost of building terminals to load crude onto rail cars and terminals to take crude off of rail cars, because the railroad infrastructure already existed. So now all of a sudden you started seeing the large companies starting to support rail as maybe a long-term solution for the marketplace. Well, this all looked really great. Entrepreneurs are coming in, investors are coming in, we're having some great successes. Everybody is working hard to do it in a very professional way, in a very safe way. Over time, those who were kind of cowboying it very early on, just trying to figure it out, was so slowly drifted away, because the big institutions, they certainly can't afford to take those types of risks, safety risk, environmental risk, health risks. And so it was becoming very, very professionalized. And then we had a series of rail car derailments. It became an extremely serious focus for the people in the industry. And we realized at that time that those of us in the industry realized at that time that the regulators, and I think the regulators also realized, and well, matter of fact, I'll just give you a small story there. There was a derailment of an ethanol train in Illinois, and I believe that was 3 or 4 years ago. And they realized that PHMSA, their actual field investigators, the number of them had dwindled down. There was, I don't know how many were left in the U.S., but they were far in between these field inspectors. And but that was a very serious accident. It wasn't too far away from a town. And so they gathered up these investigators to come to Illinois. Well, so they comb the whole industry. They're looking at all tank cars, or looking at how the railroads are performing. And they realized at that time there was a lot of crude oil on rail cars. And at that time, I'm not certain that PHMSA realized just how much crude oil was already being shipped on rail cars. So PHMSA said, oh, well, we need to address this. And they did a very, very good job, by the way. They focused on the movement of crude. They went up to every single loading terminal in North Dakota at that time, all the destinations. They did a very thorough review. They were very constructive on how they did it. They were focusing on education and making sure everybody knew all the regulations and all the checklists and how to do everything and what the responsibilities were and how to report it, and then they also focused on the railroads. So a really good example of a reaction and helping an industry to develop and focus on safety at the time. Well, so where do we stand today? Well, we've had these accidents and we've had investigations, not only from people in the industry, but PHMSA, which is part of the DOT. And all of a sudden, there was kind of 3 things that kind of stood out. One is, okay, well, the crude is dangerous. Maybe the crude should be modified before you put it in rail cars. 2 is, well, the rail cars aren't adequate. These are DOT 111s that, really were designed for something else, and we're hauling dangerous crude in them. And the third focus was on the railroads. Well, we wouldn't have this issue if the railroads did their job correctly and they wouldn't derail cars. Well, out of all of that, there's going to be action steps. Not all of them have been announced or implemented yet, but very soon. There's going to be action steps in all 3 of those areas. I would say right now the main early focus was on railroad operations. The Class 1 railroads, the big railroads that transport crude oil as well as other products very long distances, has stepped up and agreed to slow these trains down, to try to reroute them around busy communities. All the issues in and around what happened in Quebec as far as securing a train when it's not moving, all those issues have been addressed by both Canada and the U.S. in great details. The actual quality of the crude, that's still to be seen if there's anything that's going to be done there. Crude oil is a hazardous material, a Class 3 flammable. It's one of the lower levels of hazardous materials. In other words, if you get it on your skin, it doesn't hurt. If you breathe it, it doesn't kill you. If it doesn't explode, it's not radioactive. There's a whole lot of classes of dangerous goods that are much more focused on than just Class 3 flammable liquids, which that's what crude oil is classified of. But the industry and the regulators are kind of going, but mainly because of the sheer volume of crude that is being transported today and probably will continue to be transported by rail. The focus and the effort seems to be treating this crude oil in particular. Bakken crude oil has been kind of singled out in these discussions in particular as handling them in a very, very special way, just like you'd handle ammonia or something that would be very, very dangerous on a rail car. And so just something kind of general comment here. We live in the U.S. We really pride ourselves in our free markets and the way capital flows and labor flows and attention flows, the entrepreneurs coming in and solving a problem. But no one disagrees with the idea that there has to be boundaries around all of this. And it's a very difficult task for regulators to anticipate all things that might happen. And it'd be very, very constraining for regulators to guess on what needs to be done in case something else happens. And it's a little bit sad, but it's true, and it's kind of the way it has been working. When things go wrong, then people's attention gets focused, and really smart people and people like us who are in the public, we speak up, and we say, this is what we want, this is what we need, and people work toward something that will work. The whole idea that that anybody in business, on purpose, will do dangerous things or do things that put other people in danger or have externalities that are that do that on purpose. I don't know that happens anymore at all, but it's very, very rare to see that. The whole thing about regulators not doing their job, I mean, that's what they do. They do focus on these things, but it is a very difficult thing to anticipate all things and to be prepared for all things. So I just wanted to make those comments.
You should have comment cards. You should have received a card when you came in. If you have a question after these presentations, you can write it down and someone will collect them on the side. Do you want them to pass them down? Yeah, so you can pass them down. I'm going to ask a few questions up here, so you don't have to do it right now, but please be ready to. I'm going to kick off with the hardest question I have, because that's what you don't do in journalism. You don't start with your toughest question. So I'm going to break that rule. First, in the research I did, I want to make sure that this is a correct statistic. I read that both pipelines and railroads deliver better than 99.5% of their crude oil product safely. Is that still accurate? Yes, okay. So 99.5% of the product reaches its destination, no problem. Our society places an acceptable loss of life on convenience. We drive cars. Cars kill tens of thousands of people every year. Nobody's calling for no more cars or slower speed limits in general. So there are many things we do where we accept a certain amount of risk. What is an acceptable amount of damage and loss as it pertains to moving oil? There's probably a number, right? You have a number in mind? Just put the number out there.
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Well, I'll agree with the pipeline industry on this, and they've set a standard that their goal is 0 incidents. And I think that's where we need to get to, too, 0.
The issue of 0 loss of life from these incidents is just like you have that goal in the aviation, just do you think you would have that in the pipeline and rail and other forms of transport as well? The IAA doesn't have necessarily a position on that, so I'm not speaking for the IAA in that matter. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Anything?
No, absolutely. Like I said, no one, would intend any loss of life. Especially the oil industry today, and the bigger companies in particular, go through extreme lengths to continuously improve their systems and processes and their focus on safety and health and the environment as well now, especially. It's, no one really intends for all that. Now, again, some industries are inherently more dangerous than other industries. It's just, you can't get away from that. And so, it's easier to do in some industries than it is others. The oil industry and the rail industry both, you just happen to have two industries that are very dangerous. And I think, as an observer, as a customer of both, or being in the oil industry but a customer of the railroads, I see a lot of effort, a tremendous amount of effort being put into safety in the environment now too.
After a disaster, everybody's a lot more aware that there's a pipeline. I lived in Kalamazoo, as I told you, when the Enbridge pipeline broke. That was the first I knew of the company Enbridge, that there was a pipeline near the Kalamazoo River. Just had not been part of my daily life. Lived there for years. It takes a disaster sometimes to raise that level of public awareness, which then probably heightens the political awareness once the public is upset. Is there lasting change that comes from that? Or is it short-term attention and then folks move on? Have you seen lasting change for the better?
I'll speak to that for the pipelines. I think it's a little of both. After the Bellingham tragedy in 1999, you know, that was the first major pipeline incident that really caught the nationwide media. So it did cause Congress all of a sudden started having all kinds of hearings, and they passed new laws. When the Bellingham pipeline ruptured, there was no law in place that once you put a pipeline in the ground, you ever had to inspect it again. Right after the Bellingham rupture, laws went into place that you had to run internal inspection and know what was in the ground and inspect those pipelines, at least a certain percentage of them. So that was a lasting change. A lot of the integrity management that we see pipeline companies do kind of came in 2000, 2002. That's been a lasting change. There's been a rash of incidents over the last 5 years. The Inspector General, the National Transportation Safety Board, even PHMSA themselves has asked for things, and Congress hasn't reacted very much. So we haven't seen much lasting change in the recent future.
I'm from Philadelphia originally, and actually a large amount of the Bakken crude is being railed to Philadelphia, to the Philadelphia refinery and the 2 other refineries in suburbs. And I think one of the things that has changed, and there was a close call on the rail incident there, is that the local politicians are much more aware that large amounts of crude are being railed. They just didn't think about it until something gets in the news. It's something new. Before it had been tankers had come and it's loaded at the port, and the fact that there is this new change, and that politicians need to think about it. I think that they are thinking about it now, but at the same time, in terms of at the federal level, probably has had less effect.
Right. It looks like Jordan is ready to take some of the questions.
Yes, we've got some audience questions pouring in. I'll give you a two-parter here, and this is directed to everyone. But Steve, you might want to take it first. Can you talk a little bit just about how your organizations are planning on answering the concerns brought about by the growing anti-fracking, anti-Keystone movements that are ranging everywhere from here in Denton, Texas, to the West Coast, to the Northeast? And following up in that vein, if you can touch on what, if anything, is special about the Keystone debate itself and why that has become more controversial and potentially dangerous than any other pipeline projects.
And maybe back up to explain what the Keystone Pipeline is, kind of in more general terms, for those of us who are not of the industry.
Absolutely. Maybe I'll go backwards there and focus on Keystone. The Keystone Pipeline is a new pipeline that's being built by a pipeline company that already has existing pipelines that cross the Canadian border into the U.S. That expansion, I think, is 785,000 barrels, so it's a very large pipeline. For people in the industry, you know, it's kind of a benign thing, you know, back when it was announced and back when, you know, people would have expected it to be approved. And you have to remember, you know, the public, you know, it depends on what your objectives at any point in time. You know, I'm old enough to remember the 70s and the whole idea of energy independence, the whole idea of, you know, all the geopolitical issues in and around buying crude from, say, countries and from people that may or may not support our way of thinking and our activities. That was a big objective at the time. So the idea of Canada producing, a friendly country, producing crude oil to help alleviate us buying crude from other countries seemed to make a lot of sense. You know, the security of it, the whole, all the issues that was important in the 70s, that would make just common sense. Well, I think, and I am not 100% certain on this, but a lot of the reasons people are against the pipeline are they're really against the way the crude oil is being produced in Canada. And we have to realize there's been tens of billions of dollars, I'm guessing more than $80 billion invested in the technology and all the what goes into producing this crude in Canada. The Canadians and those producers have really only been focused on the U.S. as the demand. And even though they've sought out other places to take their crude, it's not been a huge focus. Okay, with this type of issue and with this new type of geopolitical concern for them, I don't know that it will affect their production of this crude. The crude will find markets, but not in the U.S. I don't think that is our objective or the people who have a problem with this. I think it's become a symbolic political issue. I think it has risen the awareness of crude production and those types of things. So I think it's been effective on that. But the externality of it has been very, very negative, I think, for people in the industry, and particularly the Canadians. In and around what each individual company does and or what we do in regards to hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, I think you have to separate those two technologies. Horizontal drilling, I don't think is very controversial. At least I've not heard many arguments against it. Horizontal drilling is just basically, instead of punching holes into pools of oil that is capped and under pressure or may not be under pressure, you're basically turning the drill bit and you're drilling 2-mile lateral horizontals, and it's kind of like mining. So you're drilling into very tight shale formations or very tight formations where oil normally will not permeate those formations and seek out a void like a pipeline. So you're drilling through that, and then you're using some type of fracturing technique to fracture that very tight formation so that it creates voids so that the oil, and remember, it's very far under the ground, so very high pressures, that oil is forced into these voids and into the pipeline. That's what's been controversial. I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding about how that might affect water supply. I think, I've heard a number of times the people who have studied this are basically saying drilling techniques that affect water supply have all been bad drilling techniques. They're not really been related to the fracturing. Some people worry about the chemicals that are used and left in the ground and or the flowback that comes back out of the ground and how that is handled. Those are legitimate concerns, but the concentration of those chemicals is very small typically. You have to remember, we actually dispose of things in very deep wells. That's another issue. Putting these very high-pressure deep disposal wells close to geological faults has not proven to be a wise thing to do. I think that type of activity, that's the whole issue about drilling is causing earthquakes. Well, I don't think it's so much the drilling. Matter of fact, it doesn't seem to be at all. It's actually disposal of the water that's being put at high pressure underground close to these faults. So companies like us, we're all very sensitive and very aware of these issues. We're a midstream company, and so companies like us are now trying to develop or commercialize technologies that clean up the flowback water or clean up the water instead of disposing it and then using more salinated water that from deep underground or fresh water even. People, midstream companies are, participating with, building gathering systems for the natural gas instead of the flaring of the natural gas. Those are how we participate. The issues about actually fracturing and horizontal drilling, those are more the E&P companies that are really focused on those.
I am curious about the Keystone, though. Carl, where is your group on the Keystone pipeline?
Well, I think what you see when you look at a lot of the pipeline fights around the country right now is a lot of the rhetoric that's going on doesn't really have anything to do with whether you can run the pipeline safely or not. It's about an alternative thing. There's people that are making up their minds based on not very good information. and I understand that. I've been to Nebraska a number of times, and there's people in local governments there that are very concerned that the Oglala Aquifer is going to be damaged, that there's going to be spills that are going to affect their property damage. A lot of this infrastructure is coming at them so fast that they're playing catch up, and there's a lot of fear involved. But I think a lot of the pipeline, the Keystone got all the focus, and a lot of the people that are focusing on the Keystone, it's not really a pipeline safety issue, it's another issue, and it has to do with climate change and those types of things, which is a totally separate argument. And while they've all been arguing about Keystone, other pipelines have been developed delivering the same amount of crude into the U.S. Other pipelines are being proposed that will take it to the east and the west coasts, and they are not getting as much focus. There's one right near me, just across the border from Washington State, that will bring an equal amount of oil into the port of Vancouver.
And this one, maybe you should talk a little bit for the audience about that the Obama administration did not approve this, that it was stopped. Why was this one the one? Why is this one? Just bad luck for TransCanada?
Well, it got caught up, and the State Department got involved, and I was even testified to Congress, and I think it was the senator from Nebraska said, of all the different agencies that could be looking at pipeline safety, I wouldn't have thought the State Department would be the one to hold up, to be looking at that. But because it crosses an international border, the U.S. State Department has to do the approval. So all this EIS on pipeline safety, something the State Department doesn't do a lot of, fell on the State Department. Because of that crossing, that pipeline got held up. It was the first one that asked for that approval. A lot of these other pipelines already existed, so they're expanding the capacity of the pipelines, or the ones in Canada are not crossing the border, they're staying in Canada.
Interesting.
Well, I worked on the Keystone Pipeline when I was in the State Department. In fact, I was the bureaucrat who initiated the bureaucratic process of the Keystone Pipeline. I can say one thing is that yes, because it crosses the border, the State Department has to approve it. And so, but basically, if it's something that high profile, it comes from the White House. It's not a State Department bureaucrat who's making that decision. Secondly, part of the process is that agencies that have much more specialized engineers and regulators than the State Department all have to actually give input into the decision. So it's not just people who are energy diplomats, as I was, who are actually giving input. I would say that yes, on the Keystone Pipeline, it has to do with a lot of other issues. I mean, it's not just environmentalists in the States. A big issue internationally has been whether, in Europe, has been whether they would put forth something called the Fuel Quality Directive, which meant that the European Union would actually say that Canadian crude oil should be taxed differently than other types of crude oil. And there's some justification for that in the sense that the negative externalities from producing oil sands are higher than, say, a conventional oil well in terms of emissions. So if the emissions are higher, then, well, if the goal is indeed to reduce emissions, you would imagine there'd be some policy response on that. If the goal is not to reduce emissions, okay, well then don't do anything. I would also say that, on the national security issue, oil is fungible and prices are set globally, and so the idea that where you purchase your crude oil from is so important, I think, is something that's well misunderstood, at least in the U.S. Congress. It's not the idea that one would have absolute energy independence when you're still subject to the world crude oil price well, I think that's just wrong-headed. And secondly, in terms of a crude oil disruption, the U.S. has a strategic petroleum reserve, which is a huge investment specifically to avoid falling into a situation of a temporary disruption. That being said, of course, it's good to have further energy integration with Canada. There are political issues about enriching certain countries, this kind of thing. But if they're going to sell the oil just to someone else, you probably have to realize that you don't have the power to affect that.
Jordan?
Here's a question for everyone. Whoever wants to seize it. Besides structural integrity issues, how vulnerable is our infrastructure to more malicious attacks, whether terrorism or otherwise?
Great question.
Well, I'll take the first crack at that. It wasn't too long after 9/11, after the attacks in New York City, that all of the national pipeline mapping system was taken off the internet because of exactly that concern. Or do we really want to make it easy so anybody anywhere in the world can find out where the pipelines are and attack them? You know, after a couple of years, it might not even been that long of analysis, both PHMSA and some of the Homeland Security organizations came back and said that they thought it was a bigger threat not having that information publicly available than hiding it. Because you have to be a pretty stupid terrorist not to be able to figure out where the pipelines are in this country. They're marked at every road crossing, they're at every river crossing. You can see them on Google Earth. I mean, they didn't give terrorists very much credit for being able to find pipelines. So they put that system back up so the public would have an understanding of where the pipelines were. I think there certainly are situations, and there's a big discussion going on right now about enhancing that mapping system to include things like the size of pipelines and the pressure, and there's lots of push and shove going on there. I don't know where it'll end up. But a lot of that information we think should be more publicly available, but there certainly is a line that you have to draw somewhere. For the reality is, I think pipelines, if you follow a pipeline, what's at the end of the pipelines is probably a bigger target than the pipeline itself if you really want to do damage. So the pipelines are not a big concern for us.
Great. Next question.
Because of differing energy needs in differing parts of the country, one of the ongoing trends right now is pipeline reversals. Can we talk a little bit about why this is occurring and what inherent risks this is bringing?
And maybe start with what it is.
Okay. Well, I'll start out with that. So as the industry developed and domestic production started declining, and our economic activity kept growing, the need for refined products in particular was growing at the time. Now it's not so much. We sought crude oil from offshore origins and built large infrastructure since World War II to bring crude oil to the U.S. and to get it to the refining complex, either along the coast or inland. And so very large pipelines were built that way. On the gas, and you guys can speak more on the gas, there are traditional fields of natural gas. Obviously, gas is used all over the U.S., and so infrastructure was built to take the gas from those fields to where it was needed. Now, with this new technology, fracking and horizontal drilling, we're finding natural gas in other places that happen to be closer to where these pipeline destinations were. So you don't need these long-haul gas pipelines going that direction. As we are producing more and more crude in older fields, and we don't have enough takeaway capacity to get them to these refinery complexes, and we're reducing the imports offshore, you don't need this infrastructure to take it offshore and take it inland. You can actually use that infrastructure to take oil from these fields and get it to the Gulf Coast, to the East Coast. And so reversing the system, basically, or repurposing pipelines is a cheap way of doing that instead of building greenfield pipes. There are issues with that. I'll let you guys speak more to that.
Yeah, I think the safety concern is both the reversal, but especially with liquid pipelines, because you're changing the hydraulic profile of the way the oil moves through the pipeline. There's also concerns about complete changes in products within pipelines. It has gone kind of hand in hand with some of these reversals. We're seeing natural gas pipelines change to oil pipelines and liquid pipelines change to gas pipelines. So the concern in PHMSA, the federal regulators, recently put out an advisory bulletin about this because they've seen some failures on pipelines that seem to be related to these reversals and changes in products, because their concern was that the industry and their rush to do these things is not always assessing the pipelines well enough to maintain the integrity for these changes.
Great.
This one's addressed to Carl, if he can take it. Small natural gas leaks seem to go without notice to the naked eye. Can you talk a little bit about how these leaks are assessed, regulated, and fixed?
Sure. I mean, it's well known that the gas distribution system, the system that delivers gas to our homes and our businesses, is full of small leaks. It's worse on the East Coast where they have a lot of old cast iron pipe, and that cast iron pipe leaks at a lot of the joints. Most of those leaks aren't hazardous. I mean, there's not the right mixture of gas and air that they will explode. So to a large degree, the small ones have been ignored for years. State by state have different regulations for how they're assessed and when you need to come in to fix those leaks. It's an ongoing issue. The issue with emissions right now is they're starting to categorize what the level of those emissions are, and I think there was kind of a light bulb moment. The White House, we were even at a meeting at the White House this past summer where they're starting to focus on emission from these pipelines because it's such a huge constituency of methane going into the atmosphere, and methane is more damaging to the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. So a lot of the emphasis on these small leaks now is a climate change issue, not a safety issue.
And this is for anyone. One thing that came up earlier is how Bakken might be considered more volatile than others. Can you talk about the difference between what makes a crude oil more volatile than others and how that compares to whether it's flammable, more explosive, et cetera?
So crude oil is made up of a whole range of chemical compounds. Most generally, there are very volatile pieces of crude oil, the light ends, C5 minus, pentanes, methane, those types of things. These are gases at room temperature typically and or just barely liquid at room temperatures. So different formations have a different percent of these very light ends in the natural composition of that crude. Some crudes like bitumen that's produced in Canada has very little light ends. So these light ends, in liquid phase, as they're under pressure or as they're in liquids, are not necessarily a big concern, but as they're transported and stored and you create, and they become gas in a void, then they potentially are flammable, and the gases are potentially explosive. That's managed in the industry. We have floating roof tanks for those types of crudes and those types of products, so there is no void for the gas to come out of the liquids. It's become a very big issue with the rail recently because as you move crude long distances, it shakes up the crude, causes gas to come out into the void. You don't fill a crude oil car all the way to the top. You leave a void. There is a safety mechanism on rail cars, a vapor relief valve, so if that pressure gets too much, that valve is supposed to pop open. When you have an accident with a crude car and there is gas in these voids, and let's just say, again, the crude oil is not explosive itself, but if it's laying in a pool fire, and it doesn't matter whether it's crude oil or water, and it's burning around it and it's heating it up and the gas can't go anywhere, say the crude car is turned over and the vapor valve is trapped, then you're going to have natural tears. In a boiler, for many, many years, all of our industries managed water boilers. You're going to have the same issue with crude oils and rail cars. There's nowhere for the gas to go. The car will tear and it'll look like an explosion, but the design of it, you can tell the tear is shooting upwards instead of exploding outward. And so those tears do work. As a matter of fact, that's been, to the public, that's what they think of on these rail car derailments. They see what they think are large explosions, say, oh my, that's crude oil is explosive. But in actuality, it's, it's just the vapor not having a place to release. So the industry is very aware of this. This is not anything new. It's managed very, very diligently in the industry, handling these gases.
We do need to wrap it up. Do you have a follow-up, Jordan?
In that same vein, can you elaborate a little bit just on some of the recent technological advances that are helping the industry get closer to zero incidents?
And we do need to make this the last answer.
Well, for pipelines, I'll just say that there's been a whole range of things that have been improved the last few years. I mean, I think the major one is a whole integrity management scheme that's put into place that operators need to know what the pipe is they have in the ground. They need to assess that pipe for where it is in the ground, assess those particular risks, and then design a plan to mitigate those risks, which includes lots of internal inspections. That's a whole new regime for all these pipelines that didn't exist 15 or 20 years ago.
Certainly the new design rail cars are, according to the industry, should have a much smaller chance if there were an overturn of rupturing with thicker skins and other safety features, so that there would be a lower chance. And this is, of course, why regulators in Canada have already made the decision to change to them. One issue with that, which I didn't mention before, which I think is important to mention, is the issue of how quick can you change over if you impose such a regulation without creating a shortage of rail cars. That's a real concern for the industry.
And for ships and barges and rail cars and pipes, again, there are processes and procedures in place, checklists, people who are actually doing things with, I'll use rail cars in particular, very, very long checklists to make sure everything is okay with that rail car, everything is buttoned up. Now, with rail cars in particular, the railroads are getting very, very active and looking at these rail cars in transit. The regulators have made it very explicit and clear what the expectations are, and people are taking it very seriously. So I think there has been a lot of attention, a lot more of attention today on these issues than ever in the past.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists today.